Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to everybody connecting to audio. I'm going to give it just a minute so that everyone can connect to audio. And then I will begin the presentation. Looks like still a few are connecting, but we're basically here. So I'm going to get us going. So welcome to the first Friday lecture for the month of November. Our speaker today is basic program instructor Jacqueline Victor. Jacqueline's lecture is entitled The Song of Roland Across Time. The first Friday lecture is supported by the Anastopoulos Lecture Series Fund in memory of basic program instructor George Anastopoulos. My name is Noah Shafitz, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Please note that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. During the lecture and during the question and answer period that follows it, you will not be able to unmute your microphones, but we invite you to enter questions for Jacqueline in the chat box at any time during today's event. Jacqueline will have a chance to respond to your questions after her lecture. During the lecture, Jacqueline and I will be able to see only a handful of your video feeds, so you may choose to leave your video on or turn it off. Jacqueline's video will be spotlighted, so the best way to view the lecture is to select Speaker View instead of Gallery View. Before I give Jacqueline a full introduction, let me tell you a little bit about the basic program and the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. Along with the basic program, the Graham School offers an array of programming across the liberal arts, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, the basic program has provided our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle of direct engagement with original texts. At the heart of the basic program is our 4-year core sequence, which offers direct encounters with some of the greatest works of the classical and Western traditions in a dedicated community of adult learners and in courses led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Registration for the winter quarter is now open, and our sections have a tendency to fill up, so I recommend that you reserve your spots in our courses as soon as you can. And in case you'd like to join year 1 of the core sequence this year, but you didn't get a chance to do so this autumn, you can join the first year of the core sequence in the winter. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on December 6th. I will be the speaker, and the title of my lecture will be No One Wants Bad Things, Desire in Plato's Meno. Today's speaker, Jacqueline Victor, received her PhD in French from the University of Chicago in 2020, specializing in medieval literature. Her published work has focused on temporality in the Romance of the Rose, while her larger research project reexamines the Romance genre, the classic Knight's Tales, through the lens of female protagonism. She joined the basic program in 2023 and previously taught at the University of Chicago as a humanities teaching fellow. Now let me hand things over to Jacqueline. Let me stop sharing my screen and invite Jacqueline to share hers.
Okay, thank you, Noah. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Noah, for that introduction. Thanks also to the Graham School for hosting these First Friday lectures. And most of all, thanks everyone for showing up. I hope that you're excited to talk about the Song of Roland today. I just wanted to make a quick announcement before I get started that if you do like medieval literature, I am this spring teaching a class on female protagonism in medieval romance. So if that's something you're interested in, just keep an eye out for it. But today I'm discussing a very different kind of text, of totally different genre, and featuring one of the most well-known protagonists of medieval literature, Roland, who is an exemplary knight and really became the sort of epic figure for France. And we'll talk more about that today. So let's get started. So in the year 778, Charlemagne's army was returning from a military campaign in what is now Spain when its rear guard was attacked and slaughtered while passing through the Pyrenees. This surprise defeat became known as the Battle of Roncevaux, or Roncevaux Pass, and several centuries later, it turned up in a manuscript as the historical event at the center of a narrative poem called the Song of Roland. This early manuscript was rediscovered at the Oxford Bodleian Library in the 1830s, and an edition was published in 1837 when it was, quote, received with enthusiasm, with an article in the French newspaper Le Monde declaring that the poem was perhaps our oldest, our true national epic. From there, the Song of Roland gained further fame as a canonical work of medieval literature, taught in introductory courses with editions destined for classroom instruction published as early as 1875. So here would be an 1875 edition of the Song of Roland. And you can see sort of in the illustrated version on the right, that this was intended probably also for young people. So there were scholarly editions published, there were editions published for classrooms, for young people, for general audience. And the work is now laden with almost 2 centuries worth of scholarly, intensive scholarly and national attention. The medievalist Bernard Sacchellini once wrote, in fact, that to be a medievalist is, in the truest sense, to take a stance on the Song of Roland. For Sacchellini, this is in part because the text was the foundational to the establishment of medieval studies in French universities. But as he notes, while it is undoubtedly a masterpiece of medieval narrative, its overriding importance in the field cannot be explained by literary merits alone. Instead, it has come to stand for something, although what it stands for has shifted over time. If, as the French scholar Gérard Genette wrote, a narrative can only ever be actualized in the time of its reading, it could be said that over time, these readings and rereadings have come to shape the Song of Roland itself. So in my talk today, I'm going to be thinking about the Song of Roland across time, focusing on some key historical events for the narrative. So here we have, starting with in 778 with this Battle of Roncevaux, which is the sort of historical event, but we'll talk about the way in which this Song of Roland sort of reworks this historical event. But theoretically, it's the historical event that the work is taking as its plot. We'll look at some 9th century accounts of that. So some accounts from people who were contemporaries with Charlemagne thinking about what that event was like. And then we'll think about what happened when we start to see something like the Song of Roland appear in the 11th and 12th centuries. How was it received? How was it working with the past event? We'll jump forward in time to the 19th century, which is a very key critical time for this work because it's not only when the work was rediscovered, but it's also when it was popularized and when it became known as the national epic of France. And then we'll jump forward a little bit more to think about how people are thinking about this work today. I'll give a couple of examples, including an artist who has reworked it from an Arabic perspective. Okay, so if you've never read the Song of Roland, I hope that this talk can serve as an introduction to this poem. So if you don't know anything about the Song of Roland, don't worry. I will be giving some background information and will be assuming that this is something that everybody can access. However, if you have read it before, I hope that I can help put the poem in a conceptual framework that will lend historical meaning to the way in which we keep this text alive through our engagement with it across time. So let's start with a basic question, though. What is the Song of Roland? So the Song of Roland is something that we refer to as a chanson de geste. So these are books about chanson de geste here. This translates literally to a song of deeds. They were a form of epic poetry popularized in medieval French literature. And when I say medieval French literature, I'm talking about a textual tradition in Old French that begins around the 11th century, but really begins to flourish in the 12th, during what is sometimes referred to as the 12th century Renaissance. The Song of Roland is a very early example. The earliest manuscript we have for it is a 12th century manuscript, but we're fairly certain that it was written in the 11th century, and so it's really one of our oldest Old French texts. While the chansons de geste, as the name implies, are indeed thought to have been songs, at least in their original form, we retain no musical notation for them, and the narrative clearly predominates over any musical considerations. So I'll still call it a song, but they're really narrative poems. So these songs or poems constituted enough of a distinct and widespread genre that already in the 12th century, the poet Jean Baudel had grouped them together as something called the matter of France, la matière de France, which he opposed to other matters like the matter of Britain, which would have been stories of King Arthur, for example, and the matter of Rome, which would have consisted of ancient stories revolving around figures such as Alexander the Great or Aeneas. The matière de France, of which were the genre of the chanson de geste, frequently featured Charlemagne or members of his lineage, as well as military conflicts between Christians and Muslims, both of which are the case with the Song of Roland. And while I'm referring to the Song of Roland as a single text, in actuality, there were multiple versions of it. It has been found in 7 manuscripts and 3 fragments, and 10 versions in other languages, besides French. And so the version I'm working with today is the best known version. It is the Oxford Bodleian version. It was the one that was found in 1830 and really sparked interest in this poem. It's considered the finest literary one. It's also the oldest. And so it really has this kind of status to it. So when people say the Song of Roland, they're usually talking about this version in particular. And you can see here, if you go onto the Oxford website, the digital Bodleian, you can actually flip through it if you want. And here's a more up-close image of the first page. So the Bodleian version, known as Digby 23, it's part of it involves a real legend for the Song of Roland. So one of the things we know, or one of the things we are told about the Song of Roland, at least, is that it was sung before the Battle of Hastings, in which William the Conqueror defeated King Harold to inaugurate the Norman French conquest of England. So if we think about it within this context, within this kind of landscape of different manuscripts circulating, in which this was the finest and the oldest, the Digby manuscript attained its preeminence due to a variety of factors, both narrative and historical. One of those factors being we think this may, of all the versions we have, this is the most likely to have been sung before the Battle of Hastings, if that indeed happened. But also as time went by and more attention accrued to this version, it became important not only as the sort of most accomplished of the Roland narratives, but also became the one with the most history. So because it was the one that was talked about, because it was the one that was read, it's the one that we find ourselves over and over dealing with. So let's start with this story. So what is the story of the Song of Roland as told in Digby 23? And I have here an image from a 15th century manuscript that actually tries to condense the entire story into one image. Don't ask me to label every part. I actually tried to look at it really closely and do that, and there were some where I wasn't quite sure. But it does, you have the idea of the poet here in the bottom right, and we'll you should be able to see some of the story as we go through it. So the Song of Roland opens in Charlemagne's camp at the end of a military campaign in Spain. Let's see, I'll give you the, nope, that's not what I wanted. There we go. So these are the opening lines of the poem. Charles the King, our emperor, has been in Spain for 7 years. He conquered the upper lands all the way to the sea. No castle resisted him. There is neither wall nor city left to destroy except Saragossa, which is on a mountain, which it's not, but the poem thinks it is. The King Marsil rules it, who does not love God. He serves Muhammad, he prays to Apollyon, he is powerless, misfortune will strike him. So we see already in this opening a reference to this kind of essential religious conflict that is going to structure the poem. But we also get a sense already for the way in which at the time period, people weren't really quite sure what Islam was. And so they're not only thinking about the fact that Muhammad is somebody that is important in Islam, but also attributing other gods to the religion. Oh, not there yet. Let's keep going. Okay. The next lines, however, take us into Marsile's camp, where a plan is hatched to avoid battle with Charlemagne. Marsile's advisors encourage him to offer gifts to Charlemagne in exchange for him leaving and going back to France, complete with a promise that Marsile will follow later and convert to Christianity. This is meant as a ruse. Marsile has no intention of converting. He sends his emissaries to Charlemagne, where we first meet Roland, Charlemagne's nephew, who speaks out against the offer they are making, saying that Marsile cannot be trusted. Roland's stepfather Ganelon, however, opposes him, and it becomes clear that there is no love lost between these two men. Ganelon's position receives the most support from the other men, and Charlemagne decides to accept Marsile's offer. When it comes time to send a message back to Marsile, who has killed the last two messengers who were sent to him, Roland volunteers, but Charlemagne rejects his offer as he is too valuable. There's a good chance that the next messenger will be killed as well. So after all the other options are eliminated, Roland says that Ganelon is the best remaining choice. Knowing that this might mean his death, Ganelon is furious, but Charlemagne compels him to accept. As revenge against Roland, Ganelon then commits a treachery, encouraging Marsile to attack Charlemagne's rearguard when they are leaving for France and to kill Roland, which will seriously weaken Charlemagne, in exchange for which Ganelon will receive a hefty reward. Marsile agrees. Sorry, I lost my place for a second. Marsile agrees to attack, and Ganelon returns to camp, and he designates Roland for the rear guard, a decision that is met with despair, but that no one, even Charlemagne, seems able to reverse. To show their loyalty, Roland's friends, Olivier, and the rest of the 12 peers volunteer to join him. These opening scenes set up Ganelon's treachery as the heart of the work. And the rest of the narrative unravels the consequences of this action. The rearguard is attacked as planned, and in the most famous scene, Olivier tells Roland to blow his horn to alert Charlemagne. Roland, however, finds this action uncourageous and refuses to do so. Following a long and explicitly described battle and on the edge of death, Roland finally blows his horn, but it is too late. Everyone, including Roland, is killed. So here's a manuscript image kind of showing the outcome of the battle, which is that everyone dies and is slaughtered. And here I have an image from the Chartres Cathedral in France. This is the Charlemagne window in the Chartres Cathedral. It has various images from Charlemagne's life, and some of which are legendary, including this one, the Roland window. So you can see it sort of towards the top. And on the right there, you have Roland, who is finally blowing his horn. And on the left, you have him when he's about to die, trying to break his sword Durandal over a rock so that it won't be stolen and taken and used by someone else. So Charlemagne hears the horn and returns to find his rearguard slaughtered. But because he's so late, the sun is about to set, making it impossible for him to chase down the remainder of Marsile's army. However, a miracle occurs. God delays the sun setting, and Charlemagne's army belatedly defeats Marsile's army. Marsile survives, but eventually dies later. Up to this point, while the narrative has continuously emphasized the religious difference between Christian Franks and the Muslim Spaniards, this difference has been primarily religious in nature. Marsile and many of his knights are portrayed as handsome and noble, with the sole fault of being Muslim, or as the text refers to them, pagan or Saracen. Now, however, a second army enters the scene. This is Balagon's army. Balagon, who's coming from Babylon, had previously agreed to help Marsile in his fight against Charlemagne, and he arrives with his army just in time to provoke yet another long battle scene, this time replete with descriptions of the troops as ugly, dark, animal-like, or practically monstrous. Charlemagne's army is victorious. They convert many Muslims, and Bramimonde, the wife of Marsile, comes back to Aix, which is Charlemagne's seat of power, with him so that she can convert out of love rather than force. Ganelon has already been taken prisoner, and at Aix he is put on trial. This begins the book's final sequence. So you can see what happens to Ganelon here in the upper right corner. He's drawn and quartered, tortured and killed. But he does try to make a case for himself. So Ganelon at his trial argues that he is not guilty because he was taking revenge against Roland, which is his right to do, and was not committing treason against Charlemagne. However, a counter-argument is put forward by another knight asserting that because Roland was fighting for Charlemagne, treachery against Roland is in fact treason against Charlemagne. A duel is fought to settle the question, and Ganelon's side loses, resulting in him and his whole family being put to death. Finally, we are confronted at the end with a tired and sad Charlemagne, who is visited by the angel Gabriel and told that he has to keep fighting the pagans. Charlemagne cries and pulls his beard when he hears this, exclaiming, "How hard is the life I lead?" And that's how the poem ends. So before getting into the historical context, we can already see that the concept of time operates thematically in the work. The opening lines tell us that this war has been going on for 7 years and the army is ready to go home, reminding me of the Iliad. Only Roland votes to stay and keep fighting. Charlemagne is depicted throughout as old, sad, and seemingly tired. The emblematic scene of Roland blowing his horn is likewise centered on time. Roland delays alerting Charlemagne, and when he eventually does so, it is too late. This lateness is emphasized by the miracle of the sun. In order to exact revenge, time must literally stop, which it does for Charlemagne. And the end of the narrative calls for an unwished-for continuation of conquest framed as a necessary crusade. In this sense of it is this sense of religious conflict that brings us back to the historical battle around which the narrative is framed. So in 778, Charlemagne's army was indeed attacked while returning to France through the Pyrenees. But according to a chronicler who was a contemporary of Charlemagne, they were not attacked by Muslims, but rather by Basques. In the life of Charlemagne, or the Vita Caroli Magni, written in the 9th century by the Frankish court scholar Einhard, who knew both Charlemagne and Charlemagne's son Louis, the battle is described as follows. While he was vigorously and almost constantly pursuing the war with the Saxons and had placed garrisons at suitable points along the frontier, he attacked Spain with as large a force as he could. After they had crossed the Pyrenees, he received the surrender of all the towns and fortified places he came to. He was returning with his army safe and intact, apart from the fact that coming home in the Pyrenean mountain range, he had to experience a brief taste of the Basque treachery. For his army was advancing with large baggage train as the place and the narrow terrain required, and the Basques had set their ambush at the top of the mountain because of the density of the forest, of which there are a great number. That is a spot most suitable to setting ambushes. They attacked the rear of the baggage train and drove the men of the rear guard and those who were marching in the rear down to the valley below. They joined the battle with them and killed them to the last man, plundered the baggage, and protected by the night, went off in every direction as fast as they could. The Basques were aided by their light weapons and the place where this happened, while the Franks were disadvantaged both by the heaviness of their arms and the unevenness of the land. In this battle, Egehard, the overseer of the king's table, Anselm, the count of the palace, and Roland, the prefect of the Breton March, were killed, along with many others. This deed could not be avenged at the time because the enemy had dispersed so that not even a rumor remained as to where they might be sought. So this is really the only encounter that we have in this sort of Latinate archive of this battle. It wasn't a major battle for Charlemagne. It was not fought against the Muslim forces that he was fighting against in Spain. And this is the only reference we have to a Roland. We don't really have any clue who Roland was. We know he was there. He was not a very important person in Charlemagne's army. So you can see already that the Song of Roland is really reworking this in an interesting way. In this description, he provides, in fact, a clear statement that the battle was fought against the Gascons or the Basques. This passage is also completely free of ideological or religious considerations. Similarly, the Song of Roland's portrayal of Charlemagne's revenge against those who attacked his rearguard is shown to have been actually the opposite. He was unable to do anything about this loss. So notably, this description of the Battle of Roncevaux immediately transitions into an account of another of Charlemagne's exploits, stating in the next sentence that he also conquered the Britons who dwelt in the extreme west of France by the shores of the ocean. So though the Song of Roland portrays this battle as being in a sort of a centralized conflict between Christians and Muslims, not only was it fought against Basques, but also in the records closest to its time, it was not really thought of as anything different from fighting against, other regional powers in what we now think of as France. We have also preserved one other life of Charlemagne from the 9th century, the Geste Caroli Magni, written by a monk known as Notker the Stammerer. Notker's text is far more religious in tone and content than Einhardt's. Einhardt is most clearly interested in court politics and conquest. But it makes no mention anywhere of the Battle of Roncevaux. On the contrary, what we learn from Notker is that the magnanimous Charles was often angry because he was urged to go out and fight against foreign nations when one of his nobles might have accomplished the task. He was kind of annoyed often at having to actually go out and fight these wars. Notker also spends considerable time detailing the gifts sent to Charlemagne by the Persian king Harun al-Rashid of the Abbasid dynasty, and is careful to tell us about the respectful relations between Charlemagne and the Muslim Persians. While we may have lost the source or sources for Charlemagne's activities in Spain upon which the Chanson de Roland claims to be based, as many medieval narratives do, it tells us at various times, the source from which I'm getting this poem says, right? That's a sort of cliche almost of medieval works. So we don't always know if they're actually referring to a real text or just trying to lend some authority to an imaginative poem. It's possible we've lost the text it was based on, or it's possible it's entirely made up. But we can see from at least these two accounts that Charlemagne's campaigns in Spain, when and if they are mentioned, are not held up as part of a larger religious conflict, despite the fact that Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, had held off the Umayyad Muslim expansion into France. So the expansion from Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, into France was held off by Charlemagne's grandfather, particularly at the Battle of Tours. And these events are recounted in these two texts, and they're praised for that. And so the fact that it doesn't take up this opportunity to cast this as a battle between Christians and Muslims is notable. So this aspect of the story is thus commonly under this aspect of the story being the idea of Charlemagne as fighting against a Muslim enemy, is commonly understood as an addition of the 11th century, an invention of the 11th century, which is particularly notable given that it occurs just prior to the First Crusade. And yet, this shift in the storyline is not as dramatic as it first may appear. Charlemagne did indeed invade Al-Andalus or Muslim Spain, and he did fight against Muslims there, but he did so at the request of and in alliance with another Spanish Muslim leader, Al-Arabi, who was the leader of Barcelona and supported a rival caliphate, the Abbasids. So what we actually see here is a conflict not between the Christians and Muslims, but rather between two separate alliances. So this is a map from the 9th century after the Umayyads, which is in red over there in Spain, have already been severely reduced. If this map had been a century earlier, it would be the opposite. It would be like this whole map would be the Umayyad dynasty. But they were defeated by the Abbasids. The Frankish Empire was allied with the Abbasids, partially because what they were worried about most was not the spread of that Muslim empire, but rather the power of the Christian Byzantine Empire. And so in order to help counter the power of the Byzantine Empire, Charlemagne was actually more closely allied with the Abbasids, who asked him to come into Spain to help put down the Umayyads. It failed, and that dynasty continued for hundreds of years. But that is why he was there. Okay. So at the time, Frankish and Abbasid interests were aligned against two common rivals, the Umayyads of Al-Andalus and the Christian Byzantine Empire. In addition, while the Latin sources we retain identify the Basques as the aggressors, the scholar Michel Zenk has pointed out that a 13th century Arabic source tells us that actually it was Al-Arabi who went back on a promise he had made, which resulted in Charlemagne taking him prisoner, and that Charlemagne's army was then attacked by Al-Arabi's son with the help of the Basques. So you can see it's actually, in terms of the historical record, a little bit confused. So we kind of find ourselves at an impasse of historical evidence, although most scholars still think it was probably just the Basque army. But whatever the case may be, we can see the Song of Roland emphasizes religious difference in a way that is absent from the historical sources. The situation they describe was not one of a stark contest between two opposing religions. Instead, they describe nuanced and shifting alliances that sometimes pitted Muslims against Muslims and sometimes Christians against Christians. So this brings us to the question of the Song of Roland itself, right, and the events it depicts through rewriting this historical event. How was this received, right, in the 11th and 12th century? Were these changes accepted as an understood part of the history? Were they understood as something that was a kind of legendary fiction? What role do we see this narrative playing, given that it's sort of a proto-crusade narrative right before the First Crusade? So I'm going to take a look now at a few ways in which we can understand how people responded to this text in its time. Obviously, it's a very difficult question to answer. We unfortunately don't have somebody just saying, I read the Song of Roland today, and here are my thoughts on it. So we're trying to find, where are the little pieces, right, that we can gather. So I've gathered a few of them, and hopefully it'll be a little bit of a fragmentary image, but hopefully it will give us some idea of how the Song of Roland operated in its own time. So there are multiple indications that the Song of Roland was not only widely popular, but that it had become an essential part of Charlemagne's legend, right? So to go back to the Chartres Cathedral, right? This not only is part of this window of Charlemagne, but it also operates a fairly prominent position, right? In the middle row here, at the top, your eyes are kind of drawn up towards it. We can't know from seeing this whether or not people thought that this was a true historical event or whether they were willing to accept some legendary inclusion within the Charlemagne window. But what it can do is ask us a question, which is, what was it about the Roland story that was so compelling that it deserved a place of honor in a highly visible and prestigious form of tribute, an expensive form of tribute, to Charlemagne's exceptional life? Why do we have Roland depicted in a life of Charlemagne? As we've seen, the narrative's depiction of Charlemagne himself is not entirely positive. It shows him as an aging king who seems to lack some degree of resolve. Is it Roland's loyalty to him that this inspires, or did the story simply capture medieval audiences to such a degree that it became unavoidably associated with Charlemagne? So these are some questions I'll just try to work around. So the Song of Roland does dramatize several important ideological concerns for the French in the 11th and 12th centuries. We have plenty of indications that the story was appreciated for reasons other than and entirely separate from its religious ideologies. Roland is most frequently referenced in other examples of chivalric literature as an example of valor. Yet, like all good heroes, he's complex, waiting too long to blow his horn out of an adherence to a code of honor. But that code of honor brings about the slaughter of the 12 peers, including himself and his closest friend, who turns against him at the end. The way in which the narrative divides valor, exemplified by Roland, and wisdom, exemplified by Olivier, this is how they're referred to: Roland le Preux, Roland the valorous, Olivier le sage, Olivier the wise, is a compelling way of thinking about the difference between the adherence to different value systems and their consequences, or how the hero's best qualities may also contain implicit flaws, not unlike, for example, questions at the heart of the Iliad. Should Roland have been worrying more about his own valor or about keeping Charlemagne's army intact? Within the developing feudal order of France, in which royal power was increasingly centralized, stories of chivalry and knightly valor often attempted to work out these various dilemmas, involving conflicting systems of honor, loyalty, love, friendship, rulership, and the idea of self-determination. So here we have a map. This isn't exactly in the time during which the Roland was written, but it is during the time in which we get its first manuscript. And this map shows the real consolidation of power that's happening at this time in France. So on the left, you have the French royal domain is there in dark blue, and the land under French rule is in green. And you can see that under Philip Augustus, who is Philip II, royal power becomes extraordinarily consolidated within 40 years' time. And this is something that people are going to be really dealing with, at least the elites in France are going to be dealing with, in terms of how much autonomy do I have, how much do I have to actually obey a king. So these chansons de geste, these songs of deeds, such as the Song of Roland, though they depict individual valor, they tend to emphasize this as a part of a collectivity. This is most evidenced by the traitor Ganelon, whose argument fails, right? Because he fails to see that attacking Roland is in fact attacking Charlemagne, which is essentially an argument for collective identity consolidated under a sovereign power. These themes of Roland must have appealed to an elite audience at the time. Along these same lines, the poem refers to Charlemagne's homeland as France, a word derived, of course, from the Franks, but that already in the 11th and 12th century figured a distinct territory from the Germanic one. Charlemagne's empire having been divided in the 9th century into two parts that would become France and the Holy Roman Empire. So this is the original division of Charlemagne's territory, the Carolingian Empire, among his three grandsons. And you can see on the left what will become France. They'll also take some of what's on the right there, or in the middle in green. At the same time, the Christian collectivity needed for the Crusades also used the designation of the Franks. So French people were referred to as Franks, but also were sort of Western Christian peoples in general when they were participating in the Crusades. So the Song of Roland can serve as both an origin story for the Kingdom of France, while also reminding Christian Europeans of their shared Frankish and Carolingian origins, placing this shared heritage within the context of a broader unifying fight between Christians and so-called pagans or Saracens. And yet the fact that the poem was said to have been sung before the Battle of Hastings raises the question of how the narrative, if seen solely through a sense of identity as framed by religion, would have been motivating for the Normans as they faced the English. Why sing the Song of Roland at that point? We can go back to the idea of French and French identity, but there's an interesting answer proposed to this question by the person who found this medieval manuscript in the Oxford Library. Right after he finds it, he writes a letter to a friend. And in this letter to a friend, he asks a question, and this is the first question that he asks about this text. And in fact, he says, I am the first to ask this question and the first to answer it with this passage. Why was the Song of Roland sung at Hastings rather than any other, right? And so this is the passage that he finds that he thinks explains it. L'Encontrant said, Charles is an extraordinary man, he who conquered Puglia and all of Calabria. He crossed the salty sea to England and won their tribute for St. Peter. So what does he want with us in our land? So he goes on to write, you see, the Norman Trouvère, which was a kind of poet, author or arranger of the poem, established a precedent in favor of William the Conqueror, who went to conquer England under the banner of St. Peter. This explanation is a little flimsy. But it does recall the earlier passage from Einhard in which the description of the Battle of Roncevaux was immediately followed by descriptions of other conquests in what is now France, including, for example, Brittany. So, it's really being used as a way of not only thinking about how the Franks are fighting against, Marsile's army or Baligan, but the Franks as a fighting entity together, right, against whomever it might be. So even though we can't be sure that this was sung before the Battle of Hastings, the fact remains that since the 12th century, it has been associated with that event. This association has been bolstered, but by what might be an accident of history. At the end of the Bodleian manuscript of the Song of Roland, the author or arranger of the poem gives his name as Turold or Turoldus. This is a Norman name, and as it happens, the famous French tapestry that depicts the Battle of Hastings, the Bayeux tapestry, also has a Turold. There is nothing to indicate that these are the same people, but they have been associated with each other ever since. So this might be a simple coincidence, but it has helped to solidify the legend of the poem as having motivated the Norman troops as they prepared their conquest for England, thus casting the Song of Roland as a kind of general battle cry for the French. So this becomes part of its reception at the time, and it's still part of its reception today. So a final indication of how the Roland was used or understood in its time, we may look at different versions to see how they modify aspects of the story. Here we have an idea of what this textual tradition was. So this is a scholar who put together an edition of all of the versions together. And he writes, the textual tradition of the Chanson de Roland, as it has survived into the modern period, reflects a series of refashionings, each carried out with a purpose, although not always readily apparent to us in the mind of its maker. So the two major ones that I have been able to notice so far, and I haven't done, admittedly, the most extensive research in every single version of the Song of Roland to ask this question. But what has surfaced for me so far has been that, first of all, there is a real interest in some of the manuscripts on genealogy. And secondly, in some of them, they take the female characters of the story and make them much more prominent. And those female characters really are Bramimonde, the wife of Marsile, whose main purpose in the story is as a possibility for conversion. And Aude, who barely exists in the Oxford manuscript. That's Roland's fiance. And she immediately, upon learning he's dead, drops dead herself. But there are other versions in which her story is more extensive. So these might tell us something about how it's used differently over time, but what actually stands out is how consistent they are. The narratives the core elements of the narrative remain consistent across all the versions. And this includes the conflict between the Christians and the Muslims. It includes the inclusion of Baligan's army. And so in a way, we can see that these were perceived as essential to the story. That Roland was not fighting against just anyone. Rather, he was a martyr whose soul is portrayed as being conveyed directly to heaven. So all of these different ways of looking at it are sort of, I'm viewing them almost as like facets on a prism. They don't always work together equally well, right? There's a sense in which this is used as a proto-crusade narrative, a sense in which it's used as a narrative, a generalized narrative that can also be applied to the English, for example. There's a sense in which it's used simply to talk about this exemplary knight, right, that we all like and part of the Charlemagne legend. And so all of these uses are occurring at once. Let's jump ahead to the 19th century when there's a renewed interest in this poem. And this will cast it in a new light, but it's a light that I would argue builds upon its earlier associations with French identity. So in the 19th century, literary studies, particularly in the field of medieval studies, were dominated by what we call a philological approach. And this approach, ultimately, I'm extraordinarily grateful for because it's what produced most of the textual apparatus that now allows us to do the work that we do. The philologists, they found manuscripts, they transcribed them, they published editions, they did detailed studies of languages. And the Song of Roland really entered into that field at a really favorable moment. Its status as one of the very earliest examples of Old French literature afforded it ample attention, and this coincided with a related interest in the 19th century for using philological studies as anchoring points for national identity. So it was meaningful for France to claim that its own national epic, in a post-revolution, post-Napoleonic moment, particularly an epic that originated with Charlemagne and that showed France to have its own hero at the very origins of its own literature. This was like a win in this sort of philological competition between countries. The Song of Roland became a story about the nation of France. Which in the narrative is referred to as France la Douce, or Sweet France, even though Charlemagne's seat was actually in Aix, which is Aachen, which is now in Germany, on the border with Belgium. But to illustrate its importance, the French scholar Gaston Paris delivered a series of lectures during the 1870 German siege of Paris, entitled La Chanson de Roland et la Nationalité Française, the Song of Roland and French Nationality. He was stating that this was France's epic, not Germany's, and it symbolized their spirit of valor under distress. Maybe we can already begin to see where the fault lines are going to develop in this as time moves forward. It's probably not surprising that in moving from the 19th to the 20th and 21st centuries, the pressure points for how this text is situated are precisely along those lines of French identity and its depiction of Islam. I'll jump ahead to a 2006 book that really started to break down aspects of how we think of the relationship between French identity and medieval French literature. This is one of my favorite scholarly works. This is a book called Medieval Boundaries by the scholar Sharon Kinoshita, who is a professor at UC Santa Cruz. And she made a very startling discovery in relation to the tradition of French literature that had at its origins, and particularly medieval literature. She noticed that, I quote, "Many of the best-known works of medieval French literature take place on or beyond the borders of France or even the French-speaking world." Her book thus reflects a broad understanding of how literature developed in France through cultural contact, or as she puts it, the thematics of cultural interaction. The first chapter of the book is appropriately on the Song of Roland. Kinoshita reads the epic as enacting a conscientious movement away from an accepted custom of parias, which was a form of tribute in which one ruler paid another to essentially leave them alone. And that it had to reject these kinds of exchange from Muslim rulers and promote violence instead. However, her larger argument engages directly with 19th century inheritance. She writes, "I examined what it might mean to disengage our understanding of Old French texts from these 19th century paradigms. Rather than casting the Roland as a fixed expression of medieval proto-national and proto-Orientalist ideologies, I argue that the crusading ethos presumed to permeate the poem from the outset is instead produced during the course of it." In other words, the poem assumes an audience that would accept the practice of parias. And it needs to convince this audience to instead adopt a desire for religious warfare. That desire does not precede the poem, but is enacted in it. By placing this argument within a book examining how French literature was shaped by interactions beyond its borders, we find implicit in Kinoshita's argument a re-examination of French identity as built upon the limits rather than the permeation of its national borders, along with a movement away from an essentializing view of religious conflict to one that is heavily historically mediated. This movement towards a re-examination of French history across borders was later exemplified in an important 2017 book, Histoire mondiale de la France, edited by the scholar Patrick Boucheron. In English, its title is France in the World, A New Global History. And its project is likewise on a much larger scale to produce a history of France through the thematics of cultural interaction. In fact, the preface to the English edition written by Stéphane Gerson sets the stakes for this kind of historical work very high. It states in its first sentence that this is an urgent book, a claim that it supports by calling attention to the way that history has in the public realm been taken over by politicians and journalists rather than by historians. For France, Gerson observes that for a long time, French historians were public intellectuals, making their voices heard in books, magazines, newspapers, and later on TV and radio. I won't read all these names. These were names of French historians. They rendered their craft topical and enthralling for a wide readership. Gerson regrets that this is no longer the case, and particularly highlights that the results of the void left by historians has been filled by a version of history that is mournful and nostalgic, in which, quote, salvation rests upon a return to imagined origins. Thus, while the 19th century may serve as a kind of ideological foil to this kind of national history, at the same time it had the merit of connecting the work of historians to a larger public. And the Song of Roland is itself an excellent example of the outcome of that connection. So as a final step in our journey through time, I want to highlight one way in which the text has been used in recent years in an artistic performance. So this is a 2017 performance by an Egyptian, or created by an Egyptian artist, Wael Shawky. He is fairly well known at this point in time. He was included, for example, in this year's Venice Biennale. And he created this piece in which he translated the Song of Roland into classical Arabic. And this is the description that accompanies it. The hour-long piece combines percussion and informal choreography with performances by more than 20 singers and musicians in the classical Arabic Fujeri style, created more than 800 years ago by fishermen in the Arabian Gulf. A translation of the French epic poem La Chanson de Roland, in which the Emperor Charlemagne's nephew Roland is commended for his heroic battle against the Saracens, a term used to describe Muslim Arabs. The Song of Roland continues Shawky's interrogations of historical narratives and notions of national, religious, and artistic identity. So again, you can see these kind of concepts coming together, coalescing around this poem. That it's sort of, this one poem is sort of able to bring out a lot of strands that are being sort of reimagined in terms of French identity in relation to other religions and nations. So within this, the performance is done through traditional Arabic singing in a form that this does not describe, but it's actually dying out, this singing method he's using. So he does not change the story, but rather tries to rethink the story through its performance by Arabic actors. The work asks the audience to reconsider the Song of Roland through an Islamic cultural lens, while also commenting on the passage of time. Partially the loss of the singing tradition, but I would argue that we would also presume that this is the way in which the passage of time in which a narrative has survived in order to be reinterpreted in a living moment of performance that could have never been imagined in the 11th century. Scholar and curator Katja Arfara, who helped commission the piece, notes that in Brechtian fashion, the work is intended to create a sense of alienation in the viewer. Go back to the image, it's nice there. But why select the Song of Roland? Presumably not only because of its narrative content, but also because of its history, the way in which it has been used and understood across time, arriving in the present moment with a story of its own. So if there's one thing that I hope to have shown today, it's that every instance of reading is one of actualization, to reuse Jeanette's term. The Song of Roland wasn't written for us, but it is ours to read now. And that process is a cumulative effort across time, one that has survived in a thread from 778 until today, that has been determined by the value that others placed on the text at another time and through a different lens, and that nonetheless comes to us fresh at each reading. I hope that the specific history that I presented here today can help deepen a reading of the Chanson de Roland, and that it will encourage rather than encumber us to enter into its stream of time. So thanks, everyone. That's all I have to say.
Thanks very much, Jacqueline. Well, I have 4 questions from the chat. If anybody else would like to have me ask a question of Jacqueline, please enter your question into the chat. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Jacqueline, is from Barbara Armstrong. This is a question about that image from the Grand Chronique de France that depicts the entire poem in one image. If you want to bring that up.
Yeah, I'll find it again.
Useful image to have up generally when we're taking the broad view here. So Barbara asks, isn't the image in the lower right a priest and an altar boy apparently during mass.
Oh, that could be. Yeah. Yeah, the clothing would suggest that, don't you think? It wouldn't have anything to do with the narrative. I mean, there's no mass that takes place during the narrative. But that would be an interesting commentary on its religious content in that sense. It's not uncommon for works of medieval art to include in them an image of the person writing or reciting the work. But I think you're actually right that this could very well be an image of a mass. Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Okay, the next question that I have for you is from Paul Drexler. Paul asks, what relationship, if any, did the Chanson de geste have with troubadour poetry, particularly in the use of native language?
There were chansons de geste that, or basically similar form of story, kind of epic stories that existed in, the Provençal or the Old Occitan language of the troubadours. However, the troubadours were much better known for their lyric poetry. And so, when people would talk about the sort of different language traditions, they would say that French was good for chanson de geste and Occitan was good for troubadour poetry, basically. So there was a sense that even though you could do the different genres in both languages, they were actually suited to one or the other, which is interesting. There are also, I mean, in the 13th century, the French come down in a crusade and, slaughter many of the Southern French troubadours, right? So Southern French troubadour culture kind of dies out due to being slaughtered by the Northern French. That was in the Albigensian Crusade. With that, all that sort of Southern French literary culture got transferred to the North. And so, at that point, the kind of language distinctions start to die out. So we're really talking about a pretty early time period, the 11th and 12th centuries, when we have like a strong literary tradition in Old Occitan that is unique and sort of very living and very viable. And they did have numerous other kinds of works. It's just not what they were best known for, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Yeah.
The next question is a multi-parter, comes from Libby Raymond. So there are two questions in here, and then there's just a note about Barbara Armstrong's question. So the first question, why was Roland written in Old French as opposed to Latin? Second, who is the author, or who are the authors? And then her note, Libby's note about Barbara Armstrong's question, she just notes that the clerical figure that Barbara Armstrong had noted in her question is interesting, and it sounds like you agree with that, Jacqueline. So those are the two questions. Why Old French rather than Latin, and who is the author, or who were the authors?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second one first because it's easier because we don't know. So there you go. We have no idea. For this Oxford Bodleian, that name Turled is what's given at the end. We don't know if that's the scribe or the poet, and if his name is Turled, we have no clue who he is anyhow. So in general, we don't know who the authors are. Now we might know some authorship for some of the other manuscripts, and I would have to look that up. It's rare to know authorship for these kinds of poems, particularly one that is so early and that probably we have to imagine it had a strong oral tradition prior to it being written down. And we have to imagine this for a couple of reasons. One, because it was so popular, so much more popular than the 7 manuscripts that it exists in. Surely we've lost manuscripts, et cetera, et cetera. Nonetheless, for a work this popular, we would expect to see it in more than 7 manuscripts. It must have circulated quite widely orally. And also because of these kinds of different strands that we see in the different manuscript versions, there were clearly versions that were circulating orally that sort of made their way into different areas and then sort of got taken up in those areas. So because of that, I think we don't know ultimately who wrote the Song of Roland, but we might have some idea who scribes were or where some alterations took place. But I don't know the names of any of those people. The other question is a sort of great question about medieval French literature in general. Why does it exist? You know, the fact that most things were written in Latin prior to this time, and at some point in time, right prior to the 12th century and really flourishing in the 12th century, all of a sudden people became interested in writing things down. That might have to do partially with what we call the 12th century Renaissance, which was you know, when you think about Gothic France and you think about the cathedrals and the art and all of that, that's really beginning in the 12th, mostly beginning in the 12th century. That was a period where there was increasing urbanization. There was increased wealth, increased trade. The Crusades actually impacted that a lot too through cultural exchange. And so at some point in time, you have a group of people who are interested in having books written in a language that they can read and understand. Why this happened, we don't entirely, was it a status, a symbol? Was it the idea that, you know, I want to have access to text too, you know, I don't want it to just be a clerical thing. Was it just a simple appreciation for the stories people were hearing, and now their increased wealth allowed them to make these books out of those stories? We don't know. But it's a shift that occurs at this time. The Roland's a really early example of it. And clearly someone was interested in taking what was almost certainly an oral story and creating a text out of it. I wish I had a better answer than that. It's a sort of big question about how vernacular literature develops to begin with. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacqueline. This all sounds very rich and complicated and interesting. I'm sure difficult to navigate. So the next question that I have comes from Dawn Ellithorpe. The question is, how should we understand the, and quote unquote, loss of this work between the 12th and 19th centuries as it relates to French identity?
Yeah, I would say it's probably more a loss in my presentation, like a loss in time. I mean, there's a couple of things I would say. One is that the work did survive past the 12th century, and there are versions we have from the third. I mean, this is an example. This is a 15th century manuscript of the Chanson de Roland, including this image. Some of the manuscripts that we have are later like this. Not a lot changes really in the reception of it, probably until we get to Orlando Furioso, the sort of Italian version of the Roland story. And that takes off. And because that's written in such a sort of unique way, it became influential as a literary text, but it really wasn't the same influence as this earlier sort of chanson de geste, Song of Roland. It sort of took that song and turned it into something else, and that became influential on its own. So I'd say, or, you know, if we wanted to have like another stage in the timeline, I would probably go to Orlando Furioso and think about what that did with the Roland and what that meant for the development of literature from that time on. But I would also say that starting in the 16th century, there was a kind of embarrassment about the Middle Ages. I mean, there was a sense that people were more interested in ancient texts all of a sudden, right? They wanted to read Aristotle and read the ancients and sort of trace their current intellectual culture back to the Greek and Roman world, sort of skipping over the Middle Ages. And because of that, a lot of these stories still survived. They were popular, but they weren't things that were considered great literature or worth the time of somebody who was very cultivated. And so they sort of fell out of favor for a long period of time. And when they came back into favor was really in the Romantic period. People became more interested again, Victor Hugo with Notre Dame de Paris, and people became interested in Gothic art, in the sort of romanticism of this period, and these stories started to come back. And so that's partially why, at least in the scholarly record, you do get kind of a gap, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Jacqueline. The next
Mhm.
question is from Rachel Ung. This is three questions, but the second two are just expanding on the first. So the big question is, could you talk a bit more about the treachery at the heart of the narrative? And then more specifically, how does the idea of treachery, or recognizing and dealing with treachery, fit in with the aristocratic value systems and political understandings of the time? Why is it so important to the narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a question I wish we were like that I could ask back. Oh, sorry, the computer. It's like, what do you think? Yeah, so one of the reasons I love the Song of Roland is because, even though I've been trying here to really take account of its reception and what it meant, and a lot of what that means is national epics and dealing with Christianity and Islam, et cetera, et cetera. What I think one of the why I think this narrative endures is because the story at the heart of it is a very, very compelling story. And it's a very human story. And it is a story about, this hero Roland, right, who has this kind of over dedication maybe to valor and courage, and creates this problem, but also the story of Ganelon, the traitor, the treacherous Ganelon. And as much as Roland is like, Roland le Preux, Roland the valorous. Ganelon is like Ganelon le traître. Like he is like the treacherous like villain of medieval literature, and he's referred to that way, like, oh, you're kind of a Ganelon, right? It's an insult. Um, so what does it mean? I mean, I there's probably multiple ways we can frame it, but one way that I'm framing it for myself is that the poem is enacting a um, a vision of power that is taking some power away from the noble barons in their ability to um, regulate their own grievances among themselves, if those grievances are going to be detrimental to the larger vision in place of this sort of leader, right? So here's Charlemagne. This is a big concept at this time in medieval France, at this time in the Middle Ages in general. And so Ganelon is very mad at Roland. Ganelon's just kind of a jerk. It's not even clear why initially he's mad at Roland. He's Roland's stepfather and he doesn't like Roland. And he has a right according to his sort of noble rights to seek revenge against Roland. But his treachery is more than that, because his treachery is not just against Roland, it's against Charlemagne. It's against the Franks. And he's seen as being somebody who has the wrong kind of value code, right? He's going to take gifts and money in exchange for his honor. And so I would say he's like the kind of the sort of bad example character, right? Like honor is more important than gifts and money. Also, you have to pay more attention to your ruler than to your petty grievances with other nobles and barons. So that's one way of framing his treachery. But I also just think it's a really interesting, like, sort of family story that's going on here. Like thinking about Aristotle's Poetics or something, that the author of this managed to make all these people related to one another. So that Ganelon is Roland's stepfather and Roland is Charlemagne's nephew. So that it's also a family story.
Thanks, Jacqueline. The
Mhm.
next entry we have is going to be a comment rather than a question, but I will put a "what do you think" at the end of it, and I'll ask you to respond. So this is from Breakorn. Bray says, toward the end of Roland, the two sides offer different rewards to their troops. The emir offers worldly honors and lands. That's a quotation. Worldly honors and lands. The emperor offers himself, France, love, and truth. There is
Mm.
no criticism of Islam here, no praise of Christianity, but it is clear which offers true nobility. It's my favorite scene in the text. And then Bray says, oh, and there's some Roman numerals, which I felt like I was getting a quiz, but I'll do my best. I think it's 245 and 246. So what do you think, Jacqueline?
Yeah, thanks, Bray, and hi, Bray. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right, Bray. That the text is portraying, and this was part of Kinishida's point, was that the text had to reframe the idea of gift giving and tribute paying, right? Which was a very common way for rulers to deal with one another at this time. I mean, you didn't want to always fight to the death, right? So it's like, okay, I'll pay you to leave. And it has to reframe that in a couple of ways. First of all, that, no, we need to fight, for our honor. These people are bad. They worship the wrong gods. But also it had to kind of portray the tribute paying as something that was kind of venal. And that was missing the true point of what is valuable. This is partly what Ganelon gets wrong. And so I think that's a great comment, Bray. I think that's really getting at the heart of part of what's going on here. I will also say that the Islamic world was far wealthier at this time than the Christian world was, and in many ways more advanced. And so in general, it was associated with luxury, which was something that worried certain people in the Christian world, because there was a real desire for the kinds of luxury that you would get from the Islamic world. And so that was often recast as not people tried to recast it as something that in fact wasn't desirable. Though many people indeed wanted the silks and the spices coming from the Islamic world.
Thanks, Jacqueline. We have gotten two more questions in the chat. I believe we should have time for both of them. So the first I'm going to read is from Karen Woolstrom. Question is, does colonialism play a part into the resurgence of the Chanson de Roland in the 19th century?
Yeah, I would say it probably does. I would say also post-colonialism plays a huge role in how it's being rethought now. I mean, it's a touchy subject in France right now. I mean, this is still something that's being sort of litigated in France right now, right? What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to have a kind of French identity? Where does that come from? Where do we locate it? What does that have to do with our relation to others? And so it's an ongoing question. I would say that even more than colonialism, I would say nationalism had a lot to do with the adoption of this as a national epic of France and its reception at the time. A lot, literary studies, that's something we have to deal with, is that our fields began as kind of nationalistic endeavors in many ways in the 19th century. They're divided up, right, into these discrete language groups. They began with these kinds of national epics, and not that there's anything wrong with having these kinds of national epics, but it is the kind of history of literary studies, at least for European literary studies. And so part of what we try to do now is think about where our assumptions come from that are sort of passed down in our field. That's something that Sharon Kaneshita was trying to do as well, to say like, well, this isn't inevitable. It was described as such in a certain period of time. But yeah, to the degree that we want to relate colonialism to nationalism, I think that would be accurate.
Thanks, Jacqueline. The last question is a second question from Barbara Armstrong. Barbara asks, has it ever been suggested that the Digby manuscript was copied in a monastery?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that. Right, where would it have been copied? I mean, we have the idea, we don't know anything about Turold and who this person may have been. Copying manuscripts in monasteries was extraordinarily common, or at least in clerical settings, which wouldn't have been distinct from Oxford at the time either. but I don't know. I'd have to look more into that. I don't know how we would know. There's the amount of information in the text. You know, sometimes visual programs will help because art historians are able to identify certain areas that certain types of visual programs come from, even certain workshops. But that has no visuals in it, the Oxford Bodleian. And so I think it would be difficult to identify a hand as belonging to a particular monastery, but I'm also not a very well-trained 19th century philologist. And that's sort of the questions that they were able to answer. So I'd have to do a little more research into that.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Well, that is the end of our questions. We have a tradition with these first Friday lectures that what we do at the end is we all unmute ourselves and express our thanks to our speaker, in this case, Jacqueline, for a great talk. So I'm going to press the Ask All to Unmute button, and please join me in giving Jacqueline a round of applause and convey your thanks with your voice if you like. Here we go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you at the next one. Take care.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.